at the still look of our donut is pretty much done. What we're going to do in this part is just add an animation, do some keyframing, and have some movement. Why? Well, it's an excuse to learn about the animation part of 3D animation, right? Because a lot of people will just want to make stills, but a large number of you will also want to add some sort of animation. So I want to include this because it is such an important part, right? So anyway, we're just going to have the most basics of the basic animation, and that is simply the plate sliding in from the left-hand side and stopping. Very simple, short, and sweet, and it's an excuse to learn about keyframing and animation. So how do we do it? Well, we have along the bottom here, we have our timeline, which is 250 frames set to default. By the way, you can define exactly how many frames will be rendered in your animation by these amounts here, start and end frame. For those of you who aren't familiar with time codes and how that relates to animation, for 1 second of animation, that is defined by your frame rate over here. So if you go to your, whatever that is, the output properties, you've got frame rate, so 24 frames per second. That means that 1 second of recorded, what is played back to the viewer is 24 frames. Now, 24 frames is what's the typical movie, cinema frame rate. It is the lowest possible frame rate you can get to before things start to feel a little stuttery and juddery and a little fatiguing of the eyes. I technically don't really like 24 because, especially for quick animations, things look stuttery, right? So I actually prefer to go 29.97. Why? I mean, I don't know. It's more familiar with TV shows. That's usually the frame rate, or just aired television typically. And there's this growing debate and movement. Things are moving more towards 60 frames per second. By the way, this whole tutorial series has been 60 frames per second, which is why you can see my hand movement so smoothly, right? I would hope. 60 frames per second, which is why you can see my hand movement so smoothly, right? I would hope. I hope you can, hope somebody noticed, right? Double the data being uploaded to YouTube. Anyway, so I'm going to set mine to 29.97 frames per second. And I want my donut to slide in 1 second. That's what I'm going off of, right? So this is the end point where I want my donut to land and sit, which means that I want to set my timeline point here to frame 30, okay? And then I want to create a keyframe here because this is the final point that I want my donut to sit. So we're going to do the keyframe on the plate because the plate has everything. And just move it to make sure that there isn't anything left behind, any sprinkles or anything. Everything should be parented to your plate. So once it's parented, we can now, on frame 30, select our plate and then hit I. So I will enable you to add a keyframe. And you get a whole list here of enable you to now, on frame 30 or anything, everything should be parented to your plate. So once it's parented, we can now, on frame 30, select our plate and then hit I. So I will enable you to add a keyframe. And you get a whole list here of asking you what sort of keyframe do you want to create. It looks confusing, right? Because it's I just create a keyframe, but you could create it for the rotation only, the scale only, or all these other ones, delta, visual. I've never used any of those before in my life. What we're going to use is lock rot, which is actually location and rotation both, right? Which is very common. So that's the one that I'm going to go with, lock rot. Okay, and when you do that, you'll see down here in your timeline, you get these little diamonds appear, right? And if you pulled this thing out here, you would see exactly what those diamonds relate to. But it's your X location, your Y location, your X, it's the 3 axes for both location and rotation. Okay, so then we're going to move back to frame number 1, all the way to the start, and then I'm going to move my plate where I want it to start. Okay, so just off frame. And then because, hey, we're going to shake it up a little bit, let's make it slide in diagonally. So I'm going to move it up along the x-axis as well. So it's just going to slide in towards the camera as well. So move it a little bit further out of frame, and then I'm going to hit I, location, rotation. Now if I hit spacebar, and I'll probably need to go into solid view mode to see it, you'll get this. Ta-da! And yeah, I just noticed we didn't do any rotation. So I want it to rotate in at the same time. Like, a little bit of a sliding motion. So I'm gonna, on frame number 1, hit R and then Z, so it's just rotating on the Z axis. And let's go for like minus 90. Or, I don't know, let's just see how that looks. Then hit I, lock, rot, and then play that back. And you should see that it's now sliding in. Yay! Awesome. And that's it. No, there's more to it. So one thing you'll note is that it just feels awkward, right? Like something's not right. The movement feels very fake. And the reason for that is that it's sliding out of frame, and we want it to feel as though it's already got movement and momentum, and then it's sliding in and it's stopping. Whereas right now, it's starting slow, speeding up, and then slowing down again, right? So that is because if you go to your animation tab up there, and then by default, yours will actually be set to dope sheet. So this is the default dope sheet. And what we're going to do is change this to graph editor. And this will show you the actual, the keyframes, but also their movement. So you can see it's slow, speeding up, and then slowing down again, okay? Now it's got all your keyframes here, so you should have like 6 separate channels for keyframes, and it's all rather confusing. So click the normalize, by the way, and then that will, because you're dealing with location and rotation, it doesn't know how to combine like location values with rotation values. It's kind of like, what's the unit system you go off to put that all on one chart? So normalize will just make things easier and just put it all in like one area and easier to read. Anyway, so what I want to do is with these starting frames here, all these, I want to make it not have that smoothed off effect. I want to make it have like a harsh start. So if I select all these, which I can do by hitting B or just dragging over it. Yeah, you don't need to hit B anymore. You can just drag over it like so. And then we're going to hit V. V on our keyboard. V for vector. Let's go that. V, and then we're going to change the keyframe type to vector. And there we go. And now you can see, if we play it back, it's no longer like speeding. It's no longer starting slow, speeding up, and then, you know, it's starting fast. So it appears as though it's already had momentum off camera, and now it's sliding in and it's stopping. And that's great. That's exactly what we want. And that's really all there is to it. So if we were to do this animation, by the way, you can see that if you just leave it playing, it's just playing and it's stopped. So we want our animation to stop at frame 30. So frame 30, sorry, I should explain that. The start and end frame, I'm setting the end frame to frame 30. So now that we've done that, you can see it's now repeating that animation. Now that's important not only for just playback here, but it means when we actually render it, you're not going to have 100 extra frames rendered at the end there where the donuts, everything is sitting perfectly still. And that's basically what it means when we actually render it, repeating that animation. So frame animation, by the way, and it's stopping. And that's great. That's exactly what we want. And that's really all there is to it. So if we were to do this animation, by the way, you can see that if you just leave it playing, it's just playing and it's stopped. So we want our animation to stop at frame 30. So frame 30, sorry, I should explain that. The start and end frame, I'm setting the end frame to frame 30. So now that we've done that, you can see it's now repeating that animation. Now that's important not only for just playback here, but it means when we actually render it, you're not going to have 100 extra frames rendered at the end there where the donuts, everything is sitting perfectly still. And that's basically, that's roughly it. Now you can play around with like timing. Like for example, you could have your rotation, like this one here. You could make the rotation stop earlier. So like the last few frames, like it's sliding in, and then the last few frames it's like stopped rotating. I don't know if you want that, or maybe you'd even want it to go the other way, like an extra bit of rotation at the end there. In fact, that does actually look kind of cool, so I might do that. Yeah, let's just do move everything back 1 frame and have the rotation end like 1 frame after. Everything back 1 frame. look kind of cool, so I might do that. Yeah, let's just do move everything back one frame and have the rotation end like one frame after. That could be kind of cool. Yeah, I like that. The other thing is I think my rotation start, I'm not seeing a lot of rotation as it flies in there. So I'm going to set this to go the minus direction even more. And then I'll apply lock rot there, lock rot, and now it's sliding in. Now it appears as though it's spinning in it a little bit more direction. So it starts at, I guess you wouldn't see it unless it was normalized. Let's hide those. Let's see the rotation. Okay, so it's starting at about minus 50 degrees. Let's hide those. Let's see the rotation. Okay, so it's starting at about minus 50 degrees along the z-axis, and then it's spinning around and it's going back to 0 degrees. So it's a full 150 degrees of rotation for my animation. But there you go. Oh, by the way, home key will like center and put everything like right in the view there. Home key will just center that for you. So that's a nice one to remember. So the plate's done, and it's fine. If you wanted to, you could add other movement to your scene. You might notice, like, you might be wondering why we're not changing or adding any animation to our coffee cup. One big reason, it's got liquid in it. So if we had that, I'd love to have the coffee cup sliding in as well, but then we'd have to like rig this liquid so that it like does this motion as it like settles. And, you know, this is probably like a 20-part series already. And people are going to look back on my channel and they're going to go, wow, a donut tutorial. Wow, it's 20 parts. Why? So I don't want to stretch this even longer to be like 30 parts just because we rigged some liquid, which is like highly unnecessary. So we're not going to do that. You're welcome to it. I'd love to see somebody try. That'd be kind of cool. But I'm not going to bother touching the coffee cup. It's just going to sit there. But one little small thing we can do, just to add a little bit of movement to it, is the focal point. So you'll remember that we set the focal point for our donut, and that's defined by this empty here, this circle, which is called DOF, right? This is the layout. It's called DOF. Well, the donut starts off camera, so we could have a little story, a little goofy little story. I don't know. We could have the depth of field, like the cameraman was focusing on that coffee cup, and then the plate slid in there, and he's like, whoa, 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 something off camera, sliding in, watch this. And then he changes the focal point to be on the donut. So let's do that. Why not? So I've got the DOF empty here selected, and I'm going to hit I, because this is the final frame. So this is where we want the depth of field to end, right? This is where we want it to focusing on the donut. So at frame 30, DOF selected, I'm going to hit I, and we're just going to select location, not rotation, because it doesn't matter. So location, and then we need to move it to the coffee cup, but we need to decide like which frame, because like if you move something like this, but you don't have the right frame set, and then you go, oh, what frame do I want it? Too late, because you didn't set a keyframe. It's now moved its position back to its old location. So anyway, you want to decide like which frame do you want to have the DOF. Like, when do you want the cameraman to notice the thing sliding in out of left frame and start to change the movement from the coffee cup towards here? And I think it's about here, right? Like you start noticing some movement, about frame 12. So frame 12, I'm going to move this G along the red axis, which is X, all the way to the back there. And then I'm just going to move it so that it's basically on the coffee cup. Up right there. Okay. And then I'm going to hit I and location again. And now when we do that, you can see that that object is flying in there. So let's see how that looks actually. Let's zoom in there, and there you go. So you can see it's crystal clear in focus before it, and then when it moves forward, the cup falls out of focus, and it's now fallen on the donut. By the way, you might notice at some point during this rotation and like animation thing, your sprinkles have started to become a little porcupiney. Can't help you there. The particle systems in Blender are a little weird. If you just select the icing and double tab, it'll go into edit mode and then back into object mode, and it'll correct itself. But I don't know. The particle systems are being revamped in Blender right now. Like two things, MantaFlow. Actually, that might not even be particles. And then particle node. So two big changes are happening, which basically means no fixes are being done for things like this, right? Like, so it's just a bug, and it's an annoying bug. But I think provided like the last frame is where the sprinkles should be, then nobody should notice that it starts off with the sprinkles a little bit haywire. I hope when we do the animation, we'll find out. But there you go. Speaking of which, by the way, before we move to the next video, if you don't like the look of your sprinkles, if you see too much intersection, because this is another like final little touch, if you see too much intersection, which I do here, of the sprinkles, just change the seeds until you find one which doesn't look as bad. So find a seed that you like, cycle through it. Yours will be totally different to mine. So it's completely random. That looks, there's a bit of intersection there. You know, this is, one of those things, right? Why doesn't Blender have a particle system which will detect intersection? It will soon, at some point, eventually, maybe, in the future. Maybe that's what particle nodes is going to include. Who knows? But I've been wanting a feature like that for years. It's not here yet. So we just have to do this for now. That might be as good as I can get it. No, I don't know. Actually, I did like 33, like the one that was straight after it. That's okay to me. I'll go with that. We're going with that. All right, so animation's happening. Let's jump over into the next video where we're going to talk about render settings and render this bad boy out. So click there, and I will see you in the next video. Time to talk about the wonderful world of rendering, where you hit a button on your keyboard and then you sit back and you wait days, weeks, sometimes months, sometimes for your hard work to materialize. Rendering, particularly rendering an animation, is quite painful for a lot of people. Because you'll see this was one single frame, and it took 16 seconds to render, which by the way is incredibly fast, as you will find out yourself, I'm sure, if you haven't already. 16 seconds, but this is a 30 frame animation, and if we were to get out a calculator, and let's say we wanted 10 seconds, just 10 seconds of animation, at 30 frames, that's 300 frames, 16 seconds, which would take us 80 minutes to render, just 10 seconds of animation, right? So you can see why, by the way, like a Pixar movie or any Disney, like fully animated movie that's an hour and a half long at least, at way more complexity, way more objects, you can see why they spend sometimes months rendering on render farms, which is just like rooms filled with servers and air blowing and just like souping through it. I actually visited the Pixar office and they got, like the render farm. They got like this neon sign. It's like render farm, always open 24/7. Like this, like looks like a pub, like 24/7. I don't know. It was kind of cute. But anyways, so point is like rendering it's painful for a lot of people, and every artist wants to reduce their render times whilst retaining quality to the highest amount. So in Blender, there are three things that really are like the cornerstones of what will contribute to your render time. The first one might sound obvious, but it needs to be said, is the dimensions, the size of the image that is being rendered. So we're rendering at 1080 by 1080, this square frame here. If we were to double the resolution, say set this from 100% to 200%, which you can do by the way, guess how much longer that would increase our render times? If we doubled the resolution, if you guessed it would double the render times, incorrect. The correct answer is it would actually quadruple the render times, because you are not only doubling the pixels this way, but also this way as well. So that is 4 times the number of pixels, which is why it's 4 times the amount. So that's a really important thing. And it took me, I remember like puzzling at that, because like I would set like the render times to 50% to do like my previews, and then I would do like 100% for the final render. And then I was like, wait a minute, why is it taking 4 times as long? I didn't account for this. And then I like asked online and someone's like, duh, there's 2 axes of pixels. I'm like, oh yeah. Anyways, so that's one important point. If you want to go 4K, good luck to you. It's going to take a really, really long time to render. I guess the other thing, if you're doing animations, another one to keep in mind is the number of frames. If you're rendering at a frame rate of 60 frames a second, guess what? You got to render double the number of frames, which is why people, I think there was a latest, not a Peter Jackson film. What was the movie? It was rendered at like 120 frames, I think. Insane. That's insane. And I'm sure their render bill was through the roof. But anyways, so that's number one, resolution. The other one is your hardware. That might sound obvious, but it needs to be said as well. The reason this frame rendered at 16 seconds, which is very fast, is because I've got 2 1080 Ti graphics cards, and they are rendering at for each one. So that's why when I hit render, you'll see that I have 2 tiles that will appear, these 2 little squares, right? It'll go tick, tick, tick. You can see there's actually 2 there. Is there 2? It looks like, oh yeah, it's happening fast enough that it looks like 1. But anyways, it's doing 2 because there are 2 graphics cards working at the same time. And if you're rendering on CPU, you would actually see probably like 16 of them, but they would be much slower. So hardware is very, very important. Yeah, some of you have been writing in the comments saying like, oh, mine's like 2 hours long. Yeah, I'll show you a couple of things we could do to maybe help with that, but it's going to be slow no matter what. And that's okay, but it's just going to be slow until you upgrade your hardware. It's just one of those things. How fast do you want it to be? Spend more money. So the final thing and the third thing that has like the biggest impact is, of course, these samples. So these samples is that grain that appears on an image. Now you can't see the samples is that grain that appears on an image. Now you can't see the grain because in the compositor, you'll remember we're using this denoise, this fancy denoise thing in 2.81. But the actual image looks like this. Very noisy, very grainy, right? And then it's doing this denoising step over the top of it. And then it's like intelligently smoothing it out. But you'll see because the image started very grainy, it's actually got some artifacts in it, particularly on this coffee cup over here. It's got this like jaggedy kind of look to it, right? So yeah, basically the higher you set your sample count to, the more grain-free and clearer it will appear, but the longer your render times will be. So yeah. You need to account for that. So one thing that is important is if we look in render view mode, we're currently using something called path trace rendering with a flat 50 samples. And you'll see that some parts of it, in fact, let's just go back to the compositor. That's probably clearer. Not the denoise mode. So yeah, some parts actually look very clear, right? Like the table, the donut, like this donut icing here looks really clear. And then other parts, like the coffee cup itself, looks incredibly noisy. So if we were to apply, like if we just doubled the sample count, right, that would help, but we would be doubling the sample count in areas that look clear versus areas that look noisy. So this is a little, I mean, this isn't really that advanced, but it's like a step that a lot of beginners don't know about. And that is that you can change from path tracing to branched path tracing, which gives you more control over where you're putting those samples. So as well as these settings up here, you also get all these settings down here. So this diffuse, glossy, transmission, AO, mesh light, subsurf, volume. That beginners don't know about, and that is that you can change from path tracing to branched path tracing, which gives you more control over where you're putting those samples. So as well as these settings up here, you also get all these settings down here. So this diffuse, glossy, transmission, AO, mesh light, subsurf, volume, that applies to the number of samples that is going to each material attribute. So diffuse is the parts that already look clear, basically. The skin of this icing, the hard table there, it looks clear, and that's the diffuse part of it. The transmission part is anything which is, like glass or water. So that is our cup over there. So if we were to set this transmission amount to, instead of one, so to explain it, it's doing 30 samples. It was previously set to 50, but I've changed this to 30. It's doing 30 samples, and then this is kind of, think of this like a multiplier. So if 30 samples on the diffuse, on the gloss, on this, and you can see actually the total count are written down here. If I set this transmission here to be 2, you can see that it's now got 30, 30, 30, 60 for the transmission, because it's 30 samples times 2 on the transmission. And that will clear up some of the, it'll clear it up on the transmission. In fact, let me do a Control B. That enables you to draw a border when you're looking through the camera. So it just singles out that one section of the frame. So we can just have a look at that. And let's set the viewport to be 30 samples. So it's exactly the same as the renderer. So it looks better now. So this is how it looks before, right? 30 samples. So that's 30 samples. You can see how noisy that looks. And then let's double that. And it should look a little bit clearer. It might not look double clear, but it should look a little bit clearer. If we set this to 10, it's now doing 30 times 10, so 300 samples on the transmission. And you'll see it is taking longer. So of course, because it's more samples, it's going to take longer. You don't usually get free clearness for nothing, but it's looking better. And then let's add some to the gloss as well. So this reflection that's coming off the side of the glass there, that's the gloss. So let's set that to 5. So 5 times on the gloss, 10 times on there. So we've got 150 glossy samples, 300 for the transmission. And that's pretty good. So you can see that we were able to clear that up, and we should have not that much of an effect over the rest of the scene. So all this other area over here should still be like rocket fast, but the glass itself, it'll take a little longer on because we're giving it more samples, because it needs more samples. So yeah. And by the way, if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, wow, I've never used branch path tracing, I only recently used it myself because I was thinking like, I was like looking at the thing and I'm like, man, it's really noisy on that coffee cup. And then I was like, wait, there's a feature in Blender where you can add more samples to the thing. And then I just delved deep into branched path tracing, and I learned all about it. So anyways, now that we've done this, let's give this a render with these new settings and see how this comes out. Okay, and this is the render that we've got. So it's now taking 39 seconds. It was 16 seconds before, but it's much clearer. So this, by the way, we haven't talked about slots, but when you're rendering something, you can set the slot and then you can go back and forth before, so basically if you want to like do a comparison, like say I make a change now and I want to do another render, you would set to an empty slot, like slot 5, then do the render, and then you can go back and revisit them. Anyways, so slot 3, this is how it looked before. 16 seconds, very noisy. slot 4, it's more than doubled the render times, but it's night and day. The clarity and the detail in that coffee cup there is much, much clearer. You're seeing a lot more detail. And when we do the denoising step, so this denoiser thing here, by the way, it's here, and we're previewing it by looking through the viewer node, and that's what's appearing in the background. But the render is actually, it's always defined by the composite node. So if you're looking in the compositor and things look different to what it is in the render, make sure that your composite and your viewer node are coming from the same place, okay? By the way, when you make a change to the composite node, it won't change your render unless you are actively looking through the, through the image editor render result. And then when you do that, it'll actually update the finished render that you have done. And there you go. So that's our nice final crisp clear render. It's going to take 39 seconds on my two GTX 1080 Ti's. By the way, if you've only got one graphics card, if you had the exact same graphics card as me and you only had one of them, it would take basically double the render time, because the extra graphics cards you add are basically, it's like having another computer assist with it, which is why a lot of like 3D artists, they have multiple graphics cards stacked up on top of each other so that they can like churn through things faster. Anyways, so that's it. Now, one other final thing we're going to turn on is motion blur. Because we've got an animation, we got to use a little bit of motion blur, and it should be nice and fast now because Blender's been recently updated so that motion blur used to take a really long time to render motion blur, but it should be relatively fast. Oh. I just realized for my comparison render, I set it to path tracing. Anyway. And one other final thing I would talk about is color grading. You can do color grading if you want. So if you go to the compositing tab over here, by the way, I'm hitting V and then Alt V to zoom in and out of the backdrop in the compositor. But anyways, after your denoiser, if you wanted to do some color grading, you could add in a color balance node, and then this would give you this setup here if you wanted to do like some fancy color grading, very similar to grading that's done on films, right? You've got the lift, gamma, gain, or what is actually preferred, because you'll manage your color data better, is offset, power, slope. Exactly looking same thing, except this middle slider here is like inverted. But anyway, if you wanted to like add like some like highlights to things, you could like increase that amount there, and you can see like the highlights are now a little tighter. And then you could also add, like, if you wanted to have maybe a little bit of a pink hue to the midtones, you could change this to the green place because this middle slider is inverted. And in doing so, if I pull this out even further, you'll see it gets really purple there, right? So you kind of like, it's, color grading is like it's like a whole other art that you have to learn to do well. So I don't know. I don't want to get too much into it, but I wanted to mention it briefly because it's something that you could do. And let's crush the midtones just a tiny little smidge there, just by increasing that light value. And that's basically all the color grading I'm going to do. Like if you wanted a really simple way to color grade, you could change your look here to be instead of medium contrast by default, like high contrast or very high contrast or the opposite direction. So you've got like some easy looks there if you want to flip through things. And then you've also got curves down there. If you wanted to just like play around with this, you can do that as well. But the color grading, proper color grading, is done in the compositor, like so. So that's it. So motion blur is set. We've set up all our things. We're going to do it. We're going to do the final render. How about this? It's finally come to it. Dun, 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 dun. It's near the end. So to do our render, we want to render into frames. So to do this final render animation, a lot of people think that to render an animation to a final video, you would go, okay, so your output is here and your file format is PNG. video, you would go, okay, so your output is here and your file format is PNG. Oh, I'm going to save it to like a movie. Don't do that, because when you do that, if you use any of these for your rendered output, what's going to happen is if you got like 99% of the way through your animation and then it crashed or your computer restarted because Windows is like, here's an update, you're going to lose it. Or you could render the full thing and then that file could become corrupted for whatever reason. That is a pain in the ass. And also, that's like a very lossy format. You're going to lose a lot of information in that. You don't want that. You want to render each frame to its own separate PNG. So you're going to end up with a folder with 30 PNGs in it afterwards. And then in the next video, we're going to be compiling that into one finished video. And we can do that inside of Blender, but it has to be done in 2 steps. It just has to be. It has to be. There's no other way. I will fight anyone who tells me otherwise, but you have to do it. It's 2 separate steps. So you're going to choose your folder here. So go ahead, find somewhere, obviously. On your computer, let's go new folder, part 5, that's what this is, and we'll call this frames. So I typically just make a new folder in my blend folder, I call it frames, and then I add another one because it's always, you have to render multiple versions of the animation because you render the full thing out, you wake up in the morning and you check it and you go, damn, I forgot to turn that collection on or whatever. So 1, that's our first one, and I'm gonna hit accept. So to render this, to start rendering it, you remember, like if you hit F12, that's to render a still frame and it's not saved anywhere until you actually go image save as. To render an animation, you go render animation. And when you do that, it'll cycle through it and it'll do frame by frame by frame. And at the end of each frame render, it will save it to the folder that you have specified as a PNG file. So this is going to take roughly 40 seconds. Calculator. 39 seconds by 30 frames. That's 60 seconds. 19 minutes? 19 minutes! That's pretty fast. I'll have lunch and I'll come back and it'll be done because we're only doing 30 frames. So leave that to render, and then in the next video, I'll show you how to compile it into the final video, and that'll be the final video of this series. So join me and I will see you there. It is the final time. It Fine. It is the final video in this series. So this is what we got at the end of our 19-minute render time animation. So it's rendered out all 30 frames, and I'm playing it back inside Blender, which you can do by going to Render, View Animation, or the hotkey Control F11, and it'll have this little window that'll pop up, and it's just basically scrolling through those frames that are rendered. You can also just left click and drag if you want to like scroll through it like that. And if you open up the folder, you should see something. It's rendered out all 30. So this is what we got at the end of our 19-minute render time animation. So it's rendered out all 30 frames. This is what we got at the end of our 19-minute render time animation. So it's rendered out all 30 frames, and I'm playing it back inside Blender, which you can do by going to Render, View Animation, or or the hotkey Control F11, and it'll have this little window that'll pop up, and it's just basically scrolling through those frames that are rendered. You can also just left click and drag if you want to like scroll through it like that. And if you open up the folder, you should see something like this: 30 images, one for each frame. And yeah, this last tutorial is quite simply how to make these still frames one video file. And you can do that one of two ways. One, if you've got a video editor like Premiere or Final Cut, you can do it inside that. So I'll show you that very quickly. And then the second way, for those of you who don't have any other software and you just want to do it inside Blender, you can actually do it inside Blender. But first, very quickly, for those of you who have Premiere, this is how you do it. It's really simple. You just go to import, double click import, and then you just select the first frame, or I guess any frame of the animation, and then check that little button down there that says image sequence. And then you just hit open. And Premiere has intelligently figured out each frame, and yeah, it's now just created one video clip down there, which if you drag it into a new sequence like this, then that's it. That's basically it. And if you want to hold that last frame, you could add like a video hold on the last one, or what I usually do is I just select the last frame of the animation and then I import that, and then that could just be like the ending of the animation, and then that's it. And that's how I compile my animations inside because I edit my tutorials with Premiere and I do a bunch of other stuff. So if I'm doing that, I make sure I use the frames inside Premiere, so it's like the best quality. But if you just want to render like just one single little video file that you can send to your phone and post it on Instagram and get some sweet likes, you can do it in Blender. But you should do it in a new Blender file so as not to mess up, all this work that you've got here. So go and yeah, just open up a new Blender file, which you can, just create a new instance of Blender. Open this up, and let's make this full screen. And then there's not a video editing tab by default, but you can create one by clicking this little plus up here. So this is the workspace, and then go video editing, video editing. Okay, so this is the video sequence editor, which is basically you can edit videos in Blender. It's something that there is a niche community of Blender users that like to use it for that. I'm personally not a fan of the Blender video sequence editor because it just makes things more hard to do than Premiere. I'm used to Premiere and I like it. But for something like just making a video out of frames, it's perfectly capable of that. So you just go add image sequence, and then find wherever it is that you've saved your images to, frames, 1, and then you're going to select all this just by hitting A. So that's select all, the same hotkey as everywhere, A, and then hit add image strip. Aha. Now you want to set your frame rate to the same frame rate that you want to, that we set it to before, which is 29.97. And then if you play it back, you should, we set it to before, which is 29.9. You want to set your frame rate to the same frame rate that you want to, that we set it to before, which is 29.97. And then if you play it back, you should see something like that. You'll see it's stretched, and that's because the dimensions, it's trying to stretch the dimensions to fit the new dimensions of this new blend file. So we'll set that to the same as it was before, which is 1080. And you'll also notice that the colors look a little weird, like they're kind of like washed out. And that's because we rendered it in filmic mode, and then it's now basically those image files are sRGB, but then it's now reading that and it's applying another filmic mode on top of it. So we need to change that to standard. And when you do that, it should look the same, hopefully, as your render originally did. And that's it. And that's all you need to do. Then if you want to like, it's a pretty quick ending animation, and then it just like stops. So if you just want to extend that and extend the final frame, if you just click and drag and just pull that out, I'm just going to pull it out to 91, which will be, it'll hold for basically 2 seconds. 2 extra seconds, which will be fine. And I'm going to set my end count frame to 90. like so. And there we go. So that's, you play it back, that's what you get. Ta-da, cool. So now the all-important output settings, which is how we make it go to a video file. So first of all, let's set the folder to, I usually put it in the same folder just to keep it all like in one place. To all-important output settings, which is how we make it go to a video file. So first of all, let's set the folder to, I usually put it in the same folder just to keep it all like in one place. So wherever the frames are, I just put it there, and then I just call it like composite. I don't know, you can give it a name if you want, but I just call it composite. And then the file format, this is where we finally get to use the movie file. So we're using FFmpeg video, which I don't know. Oh, look, it's even got a little pop-up. The most versatile way to output video frames. Yeah, I don't know. Nobody really ever uses those other ones, I think, except FFmpeg video. That is evidently the one that has all the encoding settings that you're used to in other video editors. So it's got like the container, all these settings, etc. So now this isn't a tutorial on like outputting video. Lord knows there's YouTube tutorials on that if you wanted to. But basically the container, this is how I do it. I set it to QuickTime as the container. The video codec, I leave that at F264. Sorry, H264, which is pretty common. Again, I'm not an expert in this, but it's pretty common. And then the quality, like I don't even know what these do, but like high quality sounds like the one I want. So I just go high quality. And then that's it. Then you just hit, again, Control F12, or just go render animation. And because even though this is like why wouldn't it be rendering like this default cube? It's because by default in your output post-processing settings, it will render the sequence. So as long as that sequencer box is checked there, it's not going to render the default settings here. It's going to render what is in our sequence, which is this. So Control F12 now renders this. And it's obviously lightning fast because it's not rendering anything. It's just stacking the frames into an order and then saving it as a video file. And that's done. So if we go back to that folder there, look at this. We have something which is under 1 megabyte. And if we play it in VLC, it's this. And that's it, guys. You did it! The end. Well done on making it to the end. I hope you feel confident using Blender now, and I hope you will share your render on the Blender Donut subreddit. So we're actually having a little competition. If you're watching this at the time we upload it, you've got to the end of 2019 to make something creative and cool featuring a donut somehow, and then I'm going to give 3 people a year of polygons, so you can start off 2020 right with all your textures and models covered. But really it's an excuse to just give you guys a little motivation to take what you've learned and venture out and make something new with it, because that's where the real learning happens. It's when you're actually challenging yourself by making something that you don't know how to get there until you start it. So, you know, take what you've learned with the donut, infuse it with some other tutorials. If you want to get a little bit more advanced techniques, I recommend the Anvil tutorial series, which walks you through, a little bit more advanced texturing, some sculpting, some baking. So that is recommended. It's for the old version of Blender, but having watched this, you will be fine to follow that because all the features are still the same. They're just in a few different places. But if you want to follow that, I recommend it. And also another good one, as I've recommended, is the lighting series. If you want to learn lighting, it's an underappreciated, underrated part of 3D. So if you want to watch that tutorial, you can watch that as well. But really, I'm glad you guys made it. This is it's a long series. I get it. It's often dry. It's often boring, but that's how we learn. That's how you learn Blender. But thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing your renders on the Reddit Blender Donut subreddit. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in a future video. Bye.
Make a plane. This will be our road. Make a new material with an image texture. Use a road. Hit U, unwrap, and line it up so it looks nice in the UV editor. UVs are your friend. Now model the rest of the freeway overpass. This should be easy because it's just rectangles, but don't forget your edge loops. Select all your new geometry and apply a new material. Use some sort of cement image. Unwrap it using a cube projection. It works good in this case. Make a curve. Make it curvier. Use an array modifier to extend out your overpass geometry, and a curve modifier targeting the curve. BAM! You can use those same modifiers on anything and it'll follow the road. You just might have to tweak the position a bit. Streetlights? Yeah! Mirror. Extrude. Triangulate. Wireframe modifier. A plane with edge loops is a ladder. It's a thing. Get a car model. You can model it yourself, but my guess is somebody else beat you to it. Parent the car to the path using follow path. Duplicate the car and change it up a bit. Whoa! Now just animate them weaving from side to side and you've got yourself a little car chase. Car chase. Oh, now just animate them weaving from side to side and you've got yourself a little car chase. Make a plane. In this case, make a curve. Make it curvier. Use an array